Welcome to Pure Happiness Coffee. Pure Happiness Coffee is a poem, an artwork, and a community dedicated to becoming better stewards of our world's favorite beverage. Each episode of Pure Happiness Coffee is a glimpse into one individual's coffee journey, a journey that finally connects us all. Today on Pure Happiness Coffee, we are trying something a little different. You might have noticed that I've taken a little bit of time off of my initial 3-week, 15-episode stint. And that's because I've been doing a lot of work getting ready with a lot of different kinds of projects. And one of the things I've been wanting to do on the podcast was have guests and have conversations. So today I'm extremely honored and excited to be welcoming Domenico Celli, founder of Forgotten Forest, for a conversation. And Domenico, say hello.
Hey Brent, it's a pleasure to be here with you this evening. Super excited.
Same. Domenico Celli, as I said, is the founder of Forgotten Forest, Puerto Rican coffee project, vertically integrated Puerto Rican coffee project, dealing with all aspects of Puerto Rican coffee, from the historical cultural heritage of Puerto Rico to its contemporary situation politically, culturally, in an effort to build and present Puerto Rican coffee as excellent on the world stage. But that's my opinion, and fortunately we have Domenico today to speak for himself. So Domenico, can you say a little bit about Forgotten Forest and the project?
Sure. Forgotten Forest is a social enterprise modeled project. On one side of things, we have a network of approximately 50 small-scale farmers all around La Cordillera, or the Central Mountain region in Puerto Rico, that we work directly with. And on the other side of that, we have our kind of more of our business, where we buy coffee cherries, we process them, and we produce specialty coffee, specialty cacao, and bean-to-bar chocolate that we export around the world. On the more social impact side of things, with our network of farmers, we currently operate on a kind of cohort basis where every season we kind of focus in on around 8 to 12 farmers, where we distribute heirloom coffee seedlings, native shade trees, and organic compost, along with technical assistance, agronomic technical assistance through our various partners, and other inputs, and also financial literacy education.
That's a lot. And I think that's it's worth saying that if you've been following along with Pure Happiness at all, you will know that I have been in close collaboration with some time with Forgotten Forest and Domenico and Frankie. And part of the reason that I became attracted to this project was precisely for all of the details that Domenico just shared. It's a project that, yes, is about specialty coffee. And I think it's worth saying that if you are a listener and you enjoy specialty coffee, very likely you've never had Puerto Rican coffee, and there's good reason for that, and hopefully we'll get to a little bit of why that is. And in part, it is because in order to produce specialty coffee, which is something a lot of us, I think, in the industry take for granted, it actually requires all of those things that Domenico just said. It's not something that just emerges from ex nihilo. Indeed, it takes the intentional crafting of infrastructure, and for a lot of reasons in recent Puerto Rican history, that hasn't been possible. And it's also worth mentioning that our relationship began, that's an interesting question. Maybe I should ask you, like, why are we here today? And how did our relationship begin? And could you say anything about that? Your initial impulses, or your initial understanding of Pure Happiness Coffee?
Sure. I mean, it began and has developed pretty organically, I would say. I think even between us, we think this is such an unlikely collaboration and partnership that has happened in many ways. But it really started with my brother Frankie, who goes back and forth between, you know, our farm in Puerto Rico and New York, meeting you at a cupping in Brooklyn, I believe.
Indeed. I was at a cupping at Dayglow with, I think it was was it Manhattan Coffee?
No, it was Process.
It was with Process Coffee.
And
So
it wasn't a cupping. It was they just had him at their warehouse space.
right, yeah. So we were at a tasting of Process Coffee, which is a great roaster out of Belfast, Ireland. And I met Frankie that day thanks to Norb of Obscure Coffee, who had, I think, asked you out because we were going to a tasting of Forgotten Forest at Loveless Coffee, which was the subject of episode 14. And also on that same day, I met Maria of Ventola Coffee. And so it was a legendary day in Pure Happiness mythology. and it really was the result of a conversation that Frankie Celli and I had walking back from Loveless Coffee to my apartment, where he shared in great detail and with great articulation the history of Puerto Rican coffee heritage. And it was an incredibly powerful and an interesting story. And yeah, I think since that moment, I've continued to be attracted to the project overall. I would love to know, like...
By the way, I remember that day I was on my way to make coffee deliveries in San Juan, and Frankie called me up, and he had just gotten out of the cupping, and he was like, yeah, this was great, but you need to meet this guy, Brent. Like, he's totally crazy in the best way possible. Meaning he's as crazy as us, so...
He's out of his goddamn mind.
Yeah, this guy's out of his mind. You gotta meet him.
That was just a little taste of pure happiness.
Yes.
And I would be curious, like, what did you think Pure Happiness Coffee was upon like first hearing about this?
I really didn't know. I had kind of assumed that you were like a small, like micro roaster, like some of the other people that had gone to that event and that were going over to the other event. So that's what I kind of had figured.
And so I think, yeah, it's just like such a fundamental part of my last year and this project, developing from just writing about coffee to somehow finding myself in positions where I had this encounter. And in that encounter emerged a genuine connection and relationship. And I feel so lucky to have encountered that situation. And it feels like it was I don't want to say it was meant to be, but you know, a bit feels that way. And and so here we are. And
I mean, I would say we're a very particular project and organization in a very particular position where there are no obvious paths forward for a project like us to exist. And the very unlikely and unusual blend of kind of tools that you employ to tell these kind of stories and bring your perspective to specialty coffee actually wound up potentially being a great medium and a great vehicle to kind of tell this story, and has wound up, you know, complementing what we're trying to do very, very well, and vice versa.
Yeah, so I think that's a good way into focusing a bit more on, well, first Domenico Celli, and maybe like the origins of this project of Forgotten Forest, because like I was saying before, I think a lot of people who are tuning in that might be interested in specialty coffee probably have no relationship to Puerto Rican coffee, I would imagine, or very little. So can you say how and why, maybe a little bit about yourself, where you're from, how you got to be thinking about some of these things, and the origins of this project that is a quite tremendous undertaking at the level of not just producing great coffee, but real infrastructure and a real investigation and exploration and presentation of a culture that, for many of us living in the United States, if you were not diasporic, maybe isn't on your mind every day, and maybe ought to be. So yeah, a little bit about how you got involved in this and how you started thinking about coffee and your own background.
Sure. So I grew up, you know, like most Puerto Ricans, with coffee, you know, just part of daily life, but never really thinking about coffee beyond what it was as kind of like a something that people gathered around to have breakfast and coffee, and kind of for the extended family to meet, and kind of just farming and agriculture in general. I'm New Rican, or Puerto Rican heritage, but growing up most of my life in New York and going kind of back and forth between New York and Puerto Rico, I didn't necessarily grow up on a farm or really thinking about agriculture in my day-to-day life, but grew up with my abuelos, or my grandparents, very involved in my day-to-day life, and really important part of my upbringing, and really as like kind of my second set of parents. So growing up, me, my brother and sister, we spent most of our summers in Puerto Rico, in western Puerto Rico, where most of our family is from. So Isabela, Aguada, Aguadilla, that area. And even as a young child, I always dreamed of one day being able to go to Puerto Rico and live there. However, even as a child, I didn't think that it was a realistic dream to go there as like a young person. I thought maybe one day I could retire there. So that was always in my mind as a kid, wanting to go back to Puerto Rico and being so proud of my Puerto Rican like heritage from New York, and so proud of my grandparents and my parents, and kind of our whole culture. As I started getting older, I was more conscious in my trips back and forth to the island about the major disparity just within my own family in terms of quality of life of my family that was still living in Puerto Rico versus my family that was living in New York. Like the healthcare system in Puerto Rico is very challenged. Most people that go to medical school, or most doctors, are leaving the island. There's a lot of bureaucracy in kind of the medical system in Puerto Rico, and it's a scary situation. And a lot of my family that has remained in Puerto Rico is older and needs regular medical attention. So it was very obvious to see the kind of poor condition of a lot of my family in Puerto Rico versus my family that was able to come to New York and get proper care, have a much better just day-to-day life experience. And growing up, I wasn't fully exactly aware of that explicitly, but as I started to become a teenager, middle school, high school, I got more interested in the politics and economics behind why these dynamics at play created these conditions. To fast forward a little bit, long story short of that is, by the time I was in college, I was a political science and international relations student, and I kind of turned my attention to my own family background and Puerto Rico, and trying to recognizing that it was a very unique political and economic situation that Puerto Rico is in, and kind of tracing that back. I started a project that wound up becoming my undergraduate senior thesis, which I kind of traced over the past over 150 years, from Spanish rule through American rule in Puerto Rico, food policy in the Caribbean basin, and specifically in Puerto Rico, to kind of understand why things were the way they were. And that went through Operation Bootstrap once Puerto Rico came into U.S. hands, and the kind of external decision was made to rapidly industrialize Puerto Rico, radically shift its economic and social order from one that was a more traditional agrarian society to one that was focused on a more modern service-based economy, first manufacturing, then pharmaceutical manufacturing, and then onto where we're at today, which we can talk a little bit more about later. So I did that, and then as I continued through my undergraduate studies and then graduate studies, I got more interested in what was going on today. Once I understood kind of the dynamics that historically were at play, and I started first with my family members, including my grandfather, who was like a second parent to me growing up, interviewing him, having more conversations with him about his upbringing, growing up on a sugarcane hacienda in Puerto Rico, which kind of my grandfather's harsh upbringing on a sugarcane plantation in Arecibo very much formed his trajectory in life. Very enriching part of my upbringing was being able to have access to my grandparents, 6 to 8 months out of the year in the house with us, having, conversations on politics and philosophy and whatnot. We never really got into the actual experience that he had. It was kind of something very traumatic that he had blocked out. So I was able to get some understanding of his experience, and then start talking to other extended, family members, and then just started calling up farmers, government officials, nonprofits, all sorts of rural entrepreneurs, anyone who would talk to me on the ground in Puerto Rico about what was going on. At first, this was kind of my first experience of when I started calling up farmers and government officials. It was my first experience actually feeling like, wait a minute, I'm being seen as less Puerto Rican than I feel inside. So I was calling up these farmers and like, who's this gringo, who's this American guy who wants to know about my business and whatnot. Some people thought I was working for the IRS or for the government because I was asking questions about their business. And so it took quite a bit of time to really be persistent in calling these people and really, proving, my intentions and my genuine interest in kind of understanding the situation to get them to actually talk to me. We fast forward from there.
And maybe not for bad reason. I mean, certainly there's like encounters from that relation that they have justified feelings of possible exploitation or troubling histories.
Definitely culturally and historically. When external entities are coming in and prying and asking for this type of information or having this type of intrusion, it's usually historically has been followed by all sorts of exploitation and extraction. So it has caused many people and communities to be kind of very protective and closed off in some ways, and really raising a red flag to outsiders. So totally understandable. But basically just to say that I had to become more aware at that time, or I was made more aware at that time that, I really did have a totally different experience, or in many ways a different experience than these people that I was talking to. And we kind of had to bridge that gap to get to a place where we can really understand or create more understanding. So after that time, I had wound up developing some great relationships. I now had, a dozen farmers or so that I could call up any day of the week. They'd answer the phone, be happy that Domenico was calling, and they can go rant about the problems they had at the farm that week and the local politics and whatnot. And I loved it, and they loved it as well. So around that time, I was finishing my first undergraduate thesis, and I decided that I wanted to go to Puerto Rico. This would be my first solo trip, without going with my family, that I would go to Puerto Rico and go stay with some of these farmers for about a month and go around and record in-person interviews with people that I'd been talking to over the phone. Then Hurricane Maria came. The 1 month I was supposed to spend there turned into over 4 months. I ended up being late to go back to school. Luckily, it wasn't too much of a problem. But the 1 month that I was supposed to be doing interviews turned into these 4 months that I had started a volunteer program, which is just a very bootstrapped scheduling website, which is just a calendar and a list of different farmers and their information to contact, to reach out, and then I would help coordinate bringing volunteers out to different farms who needed help with basic immediate disaster relief type stuff, like clearing farm roads, clearing very rural country roads and whatnot, clearing debris, all that kind of stuff. And since there was so much attention on Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria, we got people from all over the island all over the U.S., from Spain, from Germany, from South Korea, who came to Puerto Rico through like no advertising or anything, just found us and came to help. So that was incredible. I learned a lot really quickly. And it became, a lot of work and a big undertaking to keep it going once a lot of people started coming to the website and going out to these different farms. And we didn't want the volunteers to actually wind up being a burden with farmers who are already overworked and now having to manage logistics of people coming from all over the place. So we had some, on the ground volunteers like Carmelo from Sandra Farms and Israel Gonzalez from Sandra Farms. And many others, Alberto from Aromas del Campo, Danny from Gran Bate, a bunch of other farmers who are kind of part of this whole movement. Not just my program, but a lot of other projects and efforts that were going on to help rural communities. Which, in our case, where I was staying at Adjuntas, we didn't get power back for almost 9 months after the hurricane. And like our whole community there didn't have power and basic water and things. So that was obviously really impactful experience. I eventually had to go back to school. I was able to keep managing the program remotely. I'd be running out of classes to answer the phone to German volunteers who were showing up in the middle of nowhere, needed help finding the right farm. But we kept it going. We eventually started some collaborations and partnerships with groups like the Puerto Rican Student Coalition to get Puerto Rican college students in the U.S. and basically match them up with rural entrepreneurs and farmers who needed help with with things that young Puerto Ricans or professionals can do remotely, like helping farmers gather and apply for federal programs and local, state level and nonprofit aid programs, where the average age of a coffee farmer in Puerto Rico is over 66 years old. So many of these farmers didn't have like the basic knowledge of how to gather all these forms online and go into an online portal and be able to submit all their documents in one place. So even if they were eligible, they wasn't actually realistic for them to put everything together and get the aid that they were eligible for. So we did that for another 1.5 years while I was still going through school. For almost 2 years, I was able to come back and forth from Connecticut, where I was going to school, to Puerto Rico and kind of keep the program going. And thankfully I had support from my university to continue doing that. As soon as I graduated, I moved back to Puerto Rico full time. I was camping out in a van on the balconies of different farms when there was a spare room available in the spare room of different farmers' homes, and continuing just to, like, at this point, write grants for free for farmers to receive some of this aid, and really continue to learn about what were the real problems going on the ground. Because obviously now a lot of people think, oh, the reason why things are so bad in agriculture or coffee in Puerto Rico is because of these hurricanes. But I knew that at this point there was a crisis that like pre-existed, that predated the hurricane or any of these disasters. So yeah, I want to pin something right there, because I want to say that if you're listening, you might notice that we've heard a tale, and so far haven't gotten to coffee other than the initial impulse. But I think that's also the point, and something that is remarkable about Forgotten Forest and where you are now, because we haven't even heard the coffee story. Yeah. And it's important to say, I think, that impulse for you was initially from the place of literal aid at the level of managing and organizing volunteers and using a skill set that you had developed to attempt to shepherd farmers into aid that they deserved that weren't getting, and a broader vision historically, personally, from your own experiences growing up. I think it's really always important and interesting where we
have the experience, like early on in what you were saying, that experience of discontinuity. One way you said it was the way in your family that those folks that were living in the contiguous United States were living versus those folks that were living in Puerto Rico with healthcare, let's say, where the system is just very challenging. And that came again when you can see, for me, this is a way that some of us have experienced, like our initiation into specialty coffee, so to speak, is like in a remarkable discontinuity between what we think coffee is and then what it can be at the level of taste. And for me, that endlessly spiraled into some kind of exploration of like what's really going on here. And I think that it's important and interesting for your own experiences and a lot of our conversations that I've been, lucky to have, of having that experience as a Puerto Rican who was like, I'm this thing, my family is this thing, but something's amiss here. Something's missing in your own grandfather's maybe relationship to yourself. Something is not being told, something's being repressed, and maybe for good reason once again. And then how that cycles into your own personal exploration into these issues and finding, well, even prior to Maria, that there was already some huge disparities between what's going on in this place versus somewhere else, and then to find that exacerbated. And I just wanted to pin it there because I think, well, for Pure Happiness Coffee as well, I love specialty coffee. I love extremely good coffee. I want us all to be drinking much better coffee. But if you've tuned in at all, you'll know that my detour ends up in lots of other places. And I think, in fact, that's what's interesting about coffee. And a lot of what happens in Puerto Rico is something that happened in lots of places because they're also involved in colonial histories that render beautiful agricultural potentials into violent monocrops, into violently extractivist systems, into systems that are then abandoned and then left to, well, wherever we are in a lot of places that are experiencing a lot of the problems that you're talking about, even with like farmers aging out, so to speak, or there being, or young people leaving, young people, what do they call it? Brain drain, people going elsewhere that might be able to stay in certain places and not being able to. So with that in mind, at this point, you're volunteering, you're helping people, you're helping organize volunteers, and what emerges for you at this juncture into coffee in particular, and what then stimulates like coffee as part of the lens on these issues for you?
Sure. Well, first, just to touch on my grandfather and family part of it that you mentioned. At this point, I was living out my abuelo's like absolute nightmare for my life, which was being anywhere near Puerto Rico, being anywhere near farming. Literally growing up, my best memories around coffee, or even around my Puerto Rican identity, was sitting around late at night or super early in the morning with my abuelos and talking about all these different philosophical, ideological issues and the identity and situation of Puerto Rico. And my grandfather would literally tell me, "Don't wrap yourself in the Puerto Rican flag." That would be something that he often like repeated. And like, don't be a martyr for Puerto Rico and whatnot. And he, had a very difficult experience in upbringing in Puerto Rico before coming to the U.S., New York, and eventually working his way up and starting his own business, which still exists today, and finding success in kind of the American system and dream in some way. So he was horrified that I would choose what he sees as like this revolutionary path. He's very much was horrified and against it at first. So moving on from that, so now I was living out their nightmare and a lot of my Puerto Rican family's nightmare, which was going back to Puerto Rico and doing anything like this and anything involving the identity of Puerto Rico, anything involving traditional like values and agriculture of Puerto Rico. At this time, it was all kind of through the lens of social impact and nonprofit activities that I was doing, and it was around agriculture, and I kind of made the connection and saw agriculture in many ways as a microcosm of all the kind of broken systems and bigger dynamic in Puerto Rico that exists. So when you look at agriculture and you look at the problems and like the major systems level issues and dynamics, you can look at the banking industry in Puerto Rico and see the same dynamics at play. You could look at the shipping industry in Puerto Rico. You could look at the healthcare. You could look at government. You could look at all these different things, and it's pretty much the same dynamic at play. What I found or saw in agriculture is one, that agriculture is literally one of the foundational building blocks of identity and freedom and liberty as a people on the individual level, to the family, to the community, to a nation or an identity. So I saw kind of in a literal sense the value of agriculture, but also how culture and identity is interwoven into that, and kind of saw choosing agriculture as a place to start or a place to try to impact was something that could make a statement on a larger level across Puerto Rico. And so I started thinking about how can agriculture still be viable today in Puerto Rico. And first, I can say that today, if you look at it on paper, agriculture is on the verge of extinction. In Puerto Rico, we import over 90% of what we consume on the island, even though we have an incredible climate and soil and everything to grow all of our produce year round in Puerto Rico. And the same is true for coffee. In coffee, we consume around 30 to 32 million pounds of coffee a year in Puerto Rico. Of that, approximately 25 to 27 million of it is imported by the government from Dominican Republic, from Mexico, from other countries to Puerto Rico, blended with a small amount of Puerto Rican coffee and sold around the island.
So can I ask you a question?
Sure.
What's an easy way to summate the reason for that system in place? Because I think it's, for a lot of us, hard to wrap our heads around that the United States is in possession of, or overseas, or in some way is politically responsible for Puerto Rico. And yet these resources that are ostensibly available are not just being not utilized by the United States at large, but being crippled by policy. What's an easy way to explain that, other than to say, like, briefly that, well, of course, Puerto Rico was a Spanish colony, then it became a United States colony or neo-colony.
Yeah, I can give you the brief history if you want.
I mean, like a capsule reason. Sure. That, like, agriculture is not an easy thing for Puerto Rico to have as a driving part of the economy.
I mean, basically, it wasn't a priority for U.S. interests, is why kind of it was abandoned in the 50s through the 70s and 80s with Operation Bootstrap. There was no need for Puerto Rico to produce its own food, or the U.S. had no need for Puerto Rico to produce its own food. And today, we kind of exist as a captive market for U.S. goods, and the dynamic at play in agriculture in general and in coffee is that American and multinational companies export most of the products that we consume in Puerto Rico from the U.S. To the island. We are only our only direct trading partner is the U.S. And so the more that we import, the more the U.S. and American companies are profiting. The more that we would produce internally in Puerto Rico, the less that would be justified to bring in. For the case of coffee, for a long time, the government of Puerto Rico, or the USDA, has been the only entity that could legally import unroasted coffee to the island. In recent years, there's been some like legislative attempts and efforts to kind of break that up, but it still essentially acts as a monopoly on the importation of foreign coffee. And then on the other side of that, you have a major company, which is essentially a subsidiary of Coca-Cola Bottling Company of Puerto Rico, that buys the majority of that government coffee, blends it with a small amount of locally produced coffee, and distributes it throughout Puerto Rico. So that is the like large scale dynamic in the industry. You have kind of a duopolistic system in this case. On one side, a public entity that controls the importation of unroasted foreign coffee, and then on the distribution side, and then on the distribution side in Puerto Rico, and then on the distribution side, a private monopoly or private company that works hand in hand with the government, directly purchases the vast majority of what is imported, and blends it with a small amount of Puerto Rican coffee and sells it locally. So with that being the central dynamic of how the vast majority of coffee is moved and sold in Puerto Rico, there's very little incentive to support local production. So some would go as far to say as there is not only disincentive to not support it, but actively incentive to discourage local production. And that applies very specifically and obviously in the case of coffee, but it is more or less the same that exists across, all of agriculture and basic goods on the island. There's a small minority of hands in Puerto Rico in kind of the elite political and business kind of class that disproportionately benefits from this dynamic, and then American corporations and government as well that also benefits from this relationship.
So yeah, to very briefly summate, it's essentially structurally incentivized. Well, extractivist policies are structurally incentivized, such that if external forces are going to gain by suppressing internal production on the island, then of course they're going to. And those systems exacerbate a situation that ensures politically and economically that certain forms of development maybe don't take place. And what I'm very interested in with Forgotten Forests project overall is how coffee has become this very perfect lens on precisely this issue for a country that, it's worth saying, was one of the original founding places that coffee was grown in the Americas, along with Haiti and Martinique. And we don't usually hear about that in the history of coffee. In fact, I was just looking over Uncommon Grounds, a very kind of popular coffee history book, and it doesn't mention Puerto Rico at all. And I thought that was a quite interesting allusion. And so for you, in a way, coffee became a bit of a way to think about this issue, but beyond thinking about this issue, became an actual active project. So can you say how that transition occurred and how that's gone the last few years, that you have turned your attention toward this issue, and what you've done in the last couple of years building Forgotten Forest around what is, as obviously we understand now, more than just selling coffee, has to do with the political economy of Puerto Rico, the political economy of the coloniality of the Puerto Rican-United States relation, which also functions as, I think, a lens on coffee writ large, which is obviously something I talk about on this podcast with some regularity, that we need to face, that the systems in place in the extreme complexity and heterogeneity of coffee around the world and coffee origins, every place is this complicated and this challenging, and it can sometimes feel overwhelming. But perhaps by like more concretely speaking about what you've been doing and thinking about, we can we can get ahead of that overwhelming feeling and start to think about on the ground ways that Forgotten Forest and yourself have been working to change that in Puerto Rico as an example.
Sure. So let me take you there.
I don't want to be overwhelmed and despair yet.
So coffee is a huge source of pride for Puerto Ricans, and we are often extremely surprised when we go out into the outside world. We see that no one knows that Puerto Rico even grows coffee. Back in the early 1700s, coffee originally came here to Puerto Rico and the Caribbean from Yemen. The original coffee that came to Puerto Rico was this very old heirloom variety called Típica. And by the turn of the 19th century, Puerto Rico was the 6th largest exporter of coffee in the world. And it had really taken over the entire island economy, with Puerto Rico under Spanish rule, as well as the social order that kind of formed around it, the kind of arimao or hacienda system, where you had these large plantations and kind of sharecropper type system where you had these like families that would live on these huge plantations or these huge haciendas, kind of have their own pieces of land and manage them and sell the coffee or harvest the coffee for these larger haciendas that would then be exported out to Europe. Under Spain, we had a preferable relationship with a bunch of different countries in Europe for exporting it. So we became known as the coffee of popes and kings. And if you go to Puerto Rico today, you'll see a lot of the local brands still say the Café de Papas y Reyes or coffee of popes and kings, because we were, at a time producing coffee that was going to the royalty of Europe, of Spain, and literally to the Vatican. However, for the past over 100 years, Puerto Rico has been on the continued decline in coffee. Today, like we said, we produce a very small percentage of it. But we still have this pride and this romanticism around it, and kind of still the cultural and social order kind of around it still in many ways is felt, especially when you go deep into the Cordillera, into the mountain regions. It's literally, you experienced it a couple months ago. It's like traveling back in time, going from San Juan in the city and then driving up into the mountains, into places like Castañer and Adjuntas, and even, hearing the different kind of dialect and accents people have, and the kind of different demeanor and way of life. So in 2020, I had graduated college. I was living in Puerto Rico, still hopping around from farm to farm, writing grants, figuring out ways to help to connect farmers with potential buyers in the U.S. and internationally. And I saw kind of all this, what looked like all this funding and support coming from around the world, coming from the U.S., from the federal, state, local level, and kind of not seeing anything change, or not any real answer to the underlying problems that these farmers were facing. And so in 2020, we started this project to kind of take this from just the aid type of work and disaster recovery work that I was doing, and actually drive forward and try to address some of these underlying issues that I saw that existed in the industry. Around this time, I did this hike or exploration to this abandoned mountaintop hacienda in Adjuntas, and discovered these skinny little trees growing in this forest that had been a hacienda about 80 to 100 years ago approximately. And long story short there is that these trees turned out to be descendants of the original coffee variety that was brought from Yemen to Puerto Rico in the early 1700s, and was the actual literal variety of coffee that was being exported all around the world and had been famed for its quality over 100 years ago. First, we talked to all our vecinos, our neighbors, a bunch of the older farmers, and they told us that it was selección, which is kind of the local term for the original coffee that was brought here to Puerto Rico. And through sending samples to World Coffee Research, through working with our local agricultural extension stations, we were able to verify that these coffee seedlings, or these coffee trees, were this variety called Típica 401 or Típica 401, which is a natural mutation of the Típica that was brought from Yemen. So we had here in Puerto Rico this variety that was totally unique to Puerto Rico and was a direct descendant of the original coffee here.
So cool.
Yeah.
I must say, with everything else that you all do at Forgotten Forest, it's almost like unbelievable that in this story exists this incredible factoid, and you know, you can't call it a discovery because it was there, but a rediscovery and a reanimation, and so much a part of this project of reanimation. It reminds me of something that you said that I want to say something about, which is this feeling of going back in time. And I think on the one hand it's a beautiful metaphor, and then on the other hand, in so many ways in coffee, like, we have to remember that, well, we're all still here. No one's back in time, right? And I think that that's something that the coffee industry often depends on, which is another way of saying, like, extremely disparate lifestyles and living conditions being at the baseline of what specialty coffee is in the world. And I think that this beautiful feeling of rediscovery and reanimation is also a reanimation and presentation of that. Going back in time in this sense also means that this is in a way, I'm being a little metaphysical here, it's about the simultaneity of cultural heritage, and it's about the simultaneity of these people and our coffee and our daily habits all being intertwined, and that this comes to form in this, I almost want to say, magical interrelation with a plant. Is, in my opinion, it's just cosmologically significant, which is to say, spiritually powerful, and that's just cool. That's all I'm saying, is that's sick. And so you can continue that you've now found this new varietal. And this becomes something of a galvanizing incident or moment toward, okay, reanimation of coffee in some more profound sense for you.
Yeah. So again, at this time, I was, thinking about how I can go from the work that I was doing to kind of driving this forward. And kind of what I was thinking is the system that exists does not incentivize to do anything better. And at this point, I come to the conclusion that specialty and value-added agriculture is one potential avenue to keep small, medium-scale family farming alive in Puerto Rico, given the context that we were in, which we can talk more about that as well. But I saw coffee as one potential product where, one, there's already there's a cultural and social significance in Puerto Rico, and there's this international or global market where there's already established a commodity and specialty level for it. So meaning there's consumers around the world, in the US and Europe and Asia, who are already in the habit of paying more for coffee that has certain qualities, in terms of the flavor profiles and sensory profiles of it, as well as the kind of practices around sourcing, around growing it. So I thought that it was a good place to start. And I've always had in mind that beyond coffee, there's all other avenues and ways to continue to develop this. But decided to start with coffee. So this discovery or rediscovery came along at just the right time to kind of be the catalyst to start this project. This variety, as I began to learn about it, and call up other coffee traders and people that I've been kind of just on the internet in contact with, I came to understand that Typica and different Typica varieties were valued and people were willing to pay more for them because they're known to be very low yielding, very, very delicate, but very high quality potential varieties. And so I thought that if we created a campaign and a project around this, it would be the perfect extreme demonstration of what I believed was a viable path forward for small scale farming, which was low environmental impact, high value agriculture. So we started a crowdfunding campaign to do a 5-acre demonstration plot of approximately 5,000 to 6,000 Typica trees, which we would rescue from the forest as seedlings, raise in a nursery, and then plant back out in the field when they were mature. We would grow them in the forest that they came from, and use organic compost and different organic inputs to grow the varieties. And the idea was this would be like the extreme of low yielding, delicate coffee with the highest quality potential, with the highest standards of practices around it. And, we would find ways to trace and verify those practices as well. And then use this as a vehicle to tell the story of Puerto Rican coffee and agriculture, and potentially be a viable path to keep it alive in a significant way in Puerto Rico. So that campaign wound up doing really well. We were able to raise the initial funding to start the demonstration plot, which we did on the site of a farm that we had been working with. And from there, the success of this project and kind of the way that I approached it, which was unique, at least for Puerto Rico at the time, was I broke down the costs to like the per tree level to raise a seedling from the forest to the nursery, back out to the field, to apply compost, all these different inputs, get to the first harvest season. And so we did the crowdfunding campaign based on the cost per tree to get it to its first year of harvest. And so that's how we raised the funding. You could contribute individual trees. Every 5 trees would be a share of the first harvest, meaning once we get to our first yield of coffee for this plot, whatever we collect through the season, we would divide equally among the shares from contributors, and contributors would get literal coffee from the project, whatever volume that may be. And so that was unique in itself, that we were taking a more professional, I guess, approach to really examining the numbers behind it. Unfortunately, in Puerto Rico, because a lot of the farming is very small and informal, family kind of scale operations, there's not a lot of professionalization. So this was unique and attractive to other types of funders like NGOs and other nonprofits locally in Puerto Rico and internationally. So now we have a bunch of great partners who are, all different organizations like TechnoServe, the Peter Alfon Foundation, Para la Naturaleza, and others who support the work that we're doing and kind of amplify the work that we're doing beyond what our initial resources were. And so they basically are walking with us now to grow the project and expand it beyond one demonstration plot to this whole network that has kind of taken form, and kind of share the values environmentally, socially, culturally, and are aligned with the idea that farming is a valuable thing to keep alive in Puerto Rico.
And yeah, a quick question is, how many farmers now are in possession or are growing currently these Typica varietals?
So we are currently in the midst of our first official cohort of Typica farmers. So far, we have 5 farmers that have received Typica and planted it. We have another 4 who will be receiving their seedlings before the end of the year. After this year, we have like I said, we have about 44 farmers in the program now. So we have our next group of farmers who are in line to receive seedlings next. And we've been learning as we go along, but we have developed kind of our own protocols and ways of working with these farmers. Early on, since we had such limited resources, we were mainly just being extremely selective in picking farmers who are already kind of aligned with our practices and already had land that was somewhat forested, wasn't like deforested or anything already, to be the initial farmers in the program. Now, as we're continuing to grow and we have more support, we can start talking to farmers who are at different stages of being able to adopt the practices that we're promoting. So early on, many of the farmers were young. They were taking over their family's hacienda, taking over their grandfather's or their parents' farm. And so it made more sense to them to do it in this way. But some, other farmers who have been kind of doing farming in a more traditional, commercial way over the past several decades, it's a much bigger gap that we need to bring them along to kind of get to what the standards and practices of the program are. And we just previously didn't have the resources to engage with them. So now we're getting to that point where we're able to create transition plans to get farmers to where we need them to be able to accept this higher risk, lower yielding variety, adopt these kind of technical agronomic practices, and be able to participate in the program.
Yeah, so it's worth saying I like to abstractly analyze this because it's a project that is so completely unique for all of the reasons that we've discussed so far. It tells the story of coffee in a profound way, and I think this what continues to attract me to this whole thing, because we're talking about really one of the foundational places that coffee was first planted post being stolen from Africa. And then we're talking about a story where a boom occurs to the point of being the sixth largest producer on earth. And that was in the late 19th century, only 100 and a few years ago. And then that's completely forgotten. And yet it kind of lives on in a kind of ghostly way in Puerto Rican culture, in this pride, in this honor about coffee, and it being a functional part of the identity and the culture, even if, as you said, it's been diluted on the ground by imported coffee in this kind of interesting way. It's a genuine cultural heritage that then has been diluted by another 100 years of structural colonial behavior. And yet, what persists is both, of course, Puerto Rican cultural history and heritage, and the perseverance of people going through the struggles of being in this neocolonial situation, and right alongside it is this plant that a lot of people, say it's very difficult for coffee to grow naturally in the wild, and yet here it is. And that is, it's so fascinating, because the next thing to me is that it also could only occur now in the history of coffee, because what you're doing as well is kind of applying protocols that were only really developed in the past few decades in specialty coffee. The only reason that some of what you're doing, you're able to do is because of other recent developments in coffee, globally, which is to say the transition from our origins in specialty in the 80s or 90s into third wave that we might call, or second wave into third wave into fourth wave, wherever we are now. This is definitely something that couldn't have occurred in the 90s or the 80s. Yeah, this opportunity
has never existed. For Puerto Rican coffee.
Yeah, and well, I've been to this place, and it is insane to see what is necessary to, cultivate these plants. And I think the passion and care and delicacy that is required is also, a powerful way that, I don't know, it just speaks to what is required to make coffee good, and maybe speaks to how coffee ought to be treated a bit more globally. And the model of this situation, I do think speaks to that, and the kind of magic that occurs, because, the other side of this for me was that it wasn't just Frankie talking to me for an hour after this cupping that I met him, but it was also the coffee. I had the experience, and this is an experience I was talking to Suyog of Driftaway Coffee today, and he was saying so much of us in specialty have this kind of galvanizing moment when we taste something that you surprised us. And when I tasted this Puerto Rican coffee, an origin I had never had at Loveless on that day, it was kind of world shattering, because I had never tasted coffee from Puerto Rico that tasted so good. And I was like, holy shit. To be honest, I was like, whoa, I don't know shit. And, I like always want Pure Happiness to be announcing that feeling of, I don't know about this stuff. And to learn about it is to learn about these intense complexities and histories, and that it's worth saying this project is alive and it's ongoing, and it too is fragile. It's anything like any novel business, political, cultural project is fragile. And so these plots are planted and in the ground and will come to fruit. But like so much else in coffee, it's so much about time. Like, things take forever. You have to make serious investments. I mean, that's why so many large players and powerful entities are able to do what they can in coffee, because coffee is volatile, and it takes a long time and a lot of work, and is in that sense as well fragile, like these plants, like Forgotten Forest. Although we hope to make it very strong, it's fragile. It's precious.
Absolutely, yeah.
I will say we're at an hour.
Okay.
Not that we have to stop, but I also want to suggest and say that this project, well, this won't be the last time that we have the opportunity to speak, first of all. So if you're enjoying this conversation and you're enjoying hearing about Domenico and Forgotten Forest, you can expect to hear more about it, because undoubtedly our future collaborations will continue to yield, ideally, more thinking and more action. I mean, maybe I should say less thinking and more action. But I want to know how you feel about time, and also, like, I feel like that baseline story of getting to Tipica 401, where you are right now, is then related to you becoming essentially a processing expert in your own right, and a grower in your own right. And that's the next stage of Forgotten Forest. Yeah. Does that sound accurate to you?
So again, the conclusion that I came to about specialty and value-added agriculture being a viable pathway for small-scale Puerto Rican farmers, and then choosing specialty coffee at a starting point. Very quickly, I realized that not just coffee and not just specialty coffee, but the super high-end, highest levels of specialty coffee globally is really the only place for Puerto Rican coffee and agriculture to really exist right now. And so this has sent me down this very unexpected and exciting and crazy rabbit hole of getting into what it means to create world-class specialty coffee. And so I started, I pretty quickly exhausted the options that there were in Puerto Rico of the few people that kind of were doing specialty at some level, from the farming of it to the processing of it. As I started attending events around the country, around the world, I was in contact with incredible producers like Nelson from Rhesus Coffee in El Paraíso, Honduras, and farmers from all around the world. I really got into the science and art of producing specialty coffee and producing unique flavors, and the science and terroir and microbes and delicate balance that goes into modulating the flavor of coffee, creating profiles and sensory experiences that are valuable to this super high-end market. And then from there, it went even deeper, discovering like what quality is at the super high end of specialty coffee, and then realizing that quality was kind of just a a ticket for entry into this kind of crazy club of ultra premium coffee, and then understanding that particular profiles, types of complexity and nuances, that when you get to a certain level, all the coffee quality is super high. You know, a difference between, you know, a 90 and a 91 or 92 point coffee kind of becomes moot at that point. It kind of, once it gets to that level, now it's about the different profiles and nuances and creating all these things. So no one was doing that in Puerto Rico. You know, there's incredible people in Colombia, in Honduras and Nicaragua, in Kenya and Ethiopia and Mexico and all these other places that are kind of pushing the boundaries of specialty coffee and have been for the past several years, that didn't exist in Puerto Rico. So I kind of had to start doing it myself and ourselves as Forgotten Forest. And it's been a very unexpected and crazy journey, and something that I've fallen in love with doing and has become very natural and like programmed into me. But that's been, you know, another extension of the mission. All these other things that I didn't realize were part of achieving this mission in agriculture and in specialty coffee have become, you know, an essential part of it, and a language and a practice and a discipline that I'm now extremely fluent in. And, you know, I think, like we were saying, that's a whole nother conversation to fully get into it. But it's a whole nother part of the journey and part of the value proposition of specialty coffee and of what Forgotten Forest is offering.
Yeah. I think we could happily wrap up around this, and I will just say that, as Pure Happiness Coffee, it's been my extreme honor to come into contact with this project, because it's also taught me so much about not just Puerto Rico and the history of the relationship with the United States and Spain, and with prior to that with the indigenous folks, and those cultures all existing side by side. It's taught me about what it really means to dive even deeper, and I like that that's kind of how it went for you. That coffee is this infinite exploration, and it ought to be. And we do a great disservice to what coffee genuinely is when we abstract it into this thing we just drink in the morning. And it's hard, and it is complex. But I think Pure Happiness is the yield of that infinite potential that we never arrive at. And so I'm glad to never arrive at the infinite with you, even as we continue to explore it. And that I think this only gets even more, in some ways, like we've only scratched the surface of any of these issues. So I don't want to pretend that we've said any kind of final word about Jesus, like Puerto Rican history or the United States-Puerto Rican relationship, or what those cultural heritages mean, or the nature of violent extractive economics and anything. Only to say ambiently, these are some of the issues that we are thinking about, and that specialty coffee at its best is also trying to think about. And if and when we get the next opportunity to have and continue this conversation into maybe what it means to bring Puerto Rican coffee into the market in that way, I think we'll find, like you're saying, that, man, things get even crazier and more metaphysical and, you know, strangely scientific, and also like quite arbitrary. And in a lot of ways, specialty coffee is starting to reflexively know that about itself, like with what we've talked about in the last couple of days, that the SCA has recently included things like extrinsic value assessment as part of its information of quality. You know, we're starting to understand that these rigorous rubrics of information-driven quality metrics are not the whole story. In fact, the whole story is this ongoing like thing. And I believe like what continues to interest me at all about coffee, and in particular about this project, is that it's a story that we're all genuinely immersed in, whether we like it or not. It's not one we can opt out of. We can opt out of it, you know, mentally. We can choose to ignore a lot of the facts about coffee. Again, we were joking earlier about, we all want radical traceability and radical transparency, but can we truly handle it? Can we handle the truth? And I think that's hopefully the question we continue to ask. So if you want to learn more about Forgotten Forest Project, like definitely follow them on Instagram and visit their website, and continue to pay attention to Pure Happiness, because we will be continuing to collaborate. And you can look forward to more conversations with Domenico in the future. If you enjoyed this interview format, let me know as well. And I'm hoping to bring other folks on that are, well, I don't know if there's anyone as interesting as Domenico, but we'll find them if they're out there. And so I want to thank you for listening. And I would like to ask you if you have any final thoughts before we conclude for this episode.
What do you think? I think we're good.
We're good. Yeah. With that, we'll say more to come. And thanks so much for listening. Thank you so much, Domenico.
Thank you.